To the extent where even we talk about going to the bathroom, we have an opinion, we have direction, we have instruction on preferential actions, forbidden actions, things you shouldn't do, things you shouldn't do. Anybody know of something that you well, let me put this question correctly before I get funny answers. Something that is considered prohibited when we talk about going to the bathroom. Don't take your rings. That could be considered recommended. Prohibited meaning haram.
The toilet seat next to the back of the store.
Very good. I'm impressed that you knew that. The toilet cannot be facing the front or the back to the direction of Qibla. See, now here you go. Here you go with your what if questions. You got a lot of what if questions, right? But hang on. The direction is very, very specific. Not you, nor the vessel you empty out into, the porcelain that we have inside, can be pointing in the direction of Qibla. Or having your back to Qibla. One or the other, right? So as long as you don't perform either one of those actions, you're fine. That's it. That's an example of something that involves personal hygiene, personal involvement, but Islam has something to say about it. Now, when we talk about these three categories, right? This category is exempt from Islamic law. Why is it exempt from Islamic law? Anyone want to take a guess? It's your own belief. Fair enough. Let me elaborate on that. In these two, you have the ability to go to a jurist or someone who's a specialist in the field of Islam and ask him questions and follow his direction about how you should perform your action or how you need to take care of certain responsibilities that you may have in your day-to-day life. In this category, you don't have that ability. You don't have the ability to accept the opinion examples. So for example, where this comes in play, where we talk about fiqh, let's say you go to pray. When you start your prayer, you say Allahu Akbar and you recite Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim and you recite your first surah. Surah Fatiha. Complete. Done. Now it comes time for the second surah. And you recite Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. And you're not sure which surah you're going to recite. Part of you thinks I'm going to recite Surah Ikhlas. What Surah Ikhlas? Very good. Okay. Just making sure. Just double check. Another part of you says, I'm going to recite Surah Nas. Another says Surah Nas. Now you've recited this Bismillah and you haven't followed it up yet with a surah. Now, all of a sudden, after you finish, you stand there for about 5 seconds. You decide, okay, fine. I'm going to go with Surah Nas. I like Surah Nas. Today's Surah Nas day. Now tell me something. That Bismillah that you recited, is it a part of Surah Nas? Because if it's a part of Surah Nas, then you have to recite it again. Because prior to this, you hadn't recited it. Or is that Bismillah something general that applies to any surah and is independent of the surah? It's a precursor. It's a mandatory precaution that you have to perform it before you perform the surah. The same way we do wudu. Wudu is not part of prayer, but it's something you have to perform. What is it? Huh? The second one? Well, no, maybe I make the argument that if Allah put it in front of all the surahs except Surah At-Tawbah, that it's a part of the surah. Now, see, this is one example of where it becomes important to understand what your requirements are. Let's say another example is you're traveling and you travel for a period of 7 days and then you're not sure if you're going to stay for 10 days or the 10th day if you're staying or you're not staying. Do you pray full or do you pray half? Or another example, you leave your house and you travel exactly 14 miles from your door. Are you qasr or are you not qasr? Meaning, do you shorten your prayers or do you not shorten your prayers? Some of the mujtahideen and some of these religious scholars have come to the conclusion that the second you leave your door, your meter starts and you go 14 miles. Others have said no. In the case of Bismillah, the same thing Sayyid Khoury used to say, that Bismillah is part of the surah. So if you say Bismillah and you don't know the surah you're going to recite after it, you have to re-recite Bismillah and pair it with the surah that you're reciting with the intention that it's a part of the surah. Sayyid Sistani holds a different opinion. Sayyid Sistani says, no, Bismillah is independent. As long as you read Bismillah, you can follow it up with any surah. We're getting into very, very detailed, specific areas of fiqh. But the idea is that there's a reason that we need to have someone who can go and do the research and come back to us with the conclusions of what it is that Allah wants from us. Because while some things are obvious, and they're obvious because all of the Muslims do them, other things are not so obvious. For example, prayer with your hands folded or open. We see a large number of Muslims who pray with their hands folded, and a good portion of Muslims who pray with their hands open. What does Allah demand of you? If I pray with my hands open, is my prayer accepted? If I pray with my hands folded, is my prayer accepted? If it's accepted in both instances, do whatever you want. But if it's not, it becomes critical for you to understand or have someone who brings the research to you and comes to the conclusion that this is permissible for you to do and this is not permissible for you to do. This is the purpose of having marja'iyyat al-mujtahideen between us and Allah. Now, this mujtahid is a concept that we see established after the ghaybat of Imam Zaman. Prior to the disappearance of Imam Zaman, we saw that we had access to the A'immah. We could go to the Imam whenever we wanted. We could write him a letter and get an answer to whichever question that we have. In the absence of the Imam, we find that we don't have this ability. So what we do is we select individuals or individuals within our community, take this responsibility upon themselves to be the jurists and come to these conclusions. To be a jurist is known as something that's called wajib-i-kifai. Anybody know what that means without calling out? Wajib-kifai.
If one person does it, the other people don't have to.
If one person does it, the other people don't have to do it. Alright? I see test question written on this, so. Kifai. We'll go kifai, like that. Hussein, you know the other half? What's the other half of the rule? If one person does it,
Done.
nobody else has to.
Yeah. And
If nobody does it,
everybody goes to.
everybody gets punishment for it. So we say, if one person does it, it's kafi, sufficient, kifaya. No one else has to do it. But if nobody does it, everybody gets punished. Who knows of one other example of wajib kifaya? Namaz janaza, very good. Or ghusl al-mayyit, to wash a dead body of a Muslim. It's mandatory on everybody unless if somebody performs it, then it's off of everybody's shoulders. Very good. So, this ijtihad, this struggling, this striving in the way of knowledge and determining what does Allah demand of you is something that's called wajib kifaya. If you have one person in the whole world who does it, sufficient. You don't need anybody else to do it. What we find in our contemporary times, though, is that there are a number of people who are performing this action. Not a lot comparative to the total population, but maybe let's say there's 20 people who have this ability in the world right now to perform this action. Which one do we follow? How do you make a decision between these 20 people who are sitting there and giving you guidance that I should do this person's taqleed or I should follow or emulate? Taqleed, by the way, is emulate. Emulate. I should emulate the actions of this scholar or that scholar or this scholar. What?
You look at their ideas, and if they're like close to yours, you like.
Interesting. You look at their ideas, and if they're close to yours, you follow them. But what if my ideology is that pork should be halal? I live in America. Pork is a very cheap form of meat. It's available everywhere, and everyone here is eating it. Or let's say another example. I live in America. In my opinion, vodka should be okay. It's not made of wine. Wine is specifically forbidden. It's not made of barley. Barley is very specifically forbidden. Why can't I have vodka? I'm just giving you an example. If I can find somebody who gives that opinion, I should follow him, no? Maybe there is. Maybe there's differences. Maybe there is somebody out there who gave this opinion at some point. How do we make the distinction? And then, right, what if for me that means that I have to wear leather socks? I like that opinion. So I'm going to find a guy who says go wear leather socks. And you like a guy who says wear shorts. You're going to wear shorts. Does that make sense? Does that bring us closer to what Allah is demanding of us? Right? Our functionality here, right? Let's go back to what our functionality here was of doing this taqleed, was to find the action that Allah is demanding of us to fulfill it so that we can fulfill our obligation to Allah without having to do the research ourselves. So how do you pick a jurist? How do you pick? What's that? Readings? Elaborate.
Check who has the most knowledge.
Check who has the most knowledge. Okay.
You have to do your own research of different tafsir of various people.
Do your own research of their tafsir or of their explanations and then come to the conclusion. Okay. Where they live. Interesting. So a guy in Las Vegas shouldn't be your mazda is what you're telling me. Might be very true. Might be, but you never know where the world is going. Let me put it to you this way, right? The way you determine who is, first off, right, there's two things we have to determine. We have to determine who is qualified. Right? And if we know who is qualified, and we have multiple people who are qualified,
Roll dice.
who do we follow?
I remember
Okay. Let's hear your level of genius.
Someone has to recommend it to you.
Someone has to recommend it to you. Ronald McDonald has a recommendation.
No, like a follower.
A follower.
Like,
No, okay. Let me bring you there. Let me give you the shortcut, okay? One, there are certain guidelines in principle and character of who is eligible to be qualified in terms of justice, in terms of scholarship, in terms of legitimacy of birth, in terms of being an adult, being a male, and we can make that list. But again, we're not going down the fifth path. We're going to go back to philosophy next week, so that's why we're going to bring it back to what's relevant. Let's just say, for example, there's 8 people out there in the world right now that everybody says this guy is a mujtahid, this guy is a marja, and this is somebody whose taqleed you can do. Right? Let's just say, for example, we take that as a given. Who do we follow? Right? Now, let's look at our philosophy, what our functionality here is. Our functionality is to get closer to what Allah demands of us and to be able to differentiate between these 8 individuals. Now, you and I as laymen, we don't have the resources or the information or the Arabic language for that matter to go back and do our own research and determine if this person's conclusion is correct or incorrect. What we do then is we rely on people who are experts in the industry to vouch for and tell us that this person is the most learned of all the other individuals and has the most information and comes to the best conclusions. Right? So when we have multiple people, we go back to one. Ahl al-khibra. Ahl al-khibra in English would be industry experts. Industry experts, we would look at criteria for industry experts. 1, live, work, deal with these jurists. 2, these industry experts know how to tell the difference in knowledge. So, these industry experts either live with these individuals, they deal with them, they work with them, they see them, they study with them, so they can tell the difference between the categories of each. The second would be, they would know the difference in knowledge. What do I mean by that? What I mean by that is, let's say, for example, you're a web designer, right? Or you write computer programs. If you write a computer program, the only person who can tell you did you write a good computer program or a bad computer program is another computer programmer, right? I can make a web page and it works just like Google, right? Works just like Google. But what a computer programmer will do is he'll open it up and say, let me see the code. Let me see how you programmed it. Let me see, did you make a nice program? Did you make a neat program? Does it logically make sense? Will it always give me the right answer? Or will it sometimes give me the right answer and sometimes it'll give me garbage? A specialist who is also a computer program can judge your computer program. The same way a jurist can see when a marja comes to a conclusion, what is the basis that he came to that conclusion on? Where is his proof that this is the right answer, that this is what Allah is asking you to do? Yes? So this is why we go to the other jurists in the area and we say, hey, is this person knowledgeable? Is this person the most knowledgeable? Does this person qualify? Let's say we say yes. So we go to, and then in our case, right, we don't have people who live with Sayyid Sistani here, do we? No, we don't. So we go to the next qualified individual we have, which is the area scholar, who then goes back and does his research and provides us those resources, so we have a chain to go through. Right? Then what we do is, we look at all these various aspects and we say, let's say we come back to 4 people. We have 4 people who we have jurists verified, everybody's agreed, these people are the most intelligent. Which one do we pick? All of them? You pick the most knowledgeable based on the information that you have available to you. Right? So you pick the most knowledgeable individual amongst these 4 and that's the taqleed that you do. Now, in modern times what we've come to is that people have come to the conclusion that I have the ability to pick a marja based on what's convenient for my lifestyle. Is this true or false? I mean, people are doing it, but is it the right thing to do? Why not?
Because you're doing it for your own good.
You're doing it for your own good.
Like, you choosing the one that going to drug use?
But brother, I mean, God created Islam. He wanted Islam to be available to the people. This guy's giving me a modern interpretation. He knows the type of life I'm living in the West. These other Maraja, they don't understand the lifestyle in the West. They don't know what my difficulties are or my problems are. So why can't I pick that one? Can I pick that one? No? Why not? You don't know why. Okay? Let me give you another example here. There are certain Maraja out there that say that industrial alcohol is najis. Now industrial alcohol, let me give you an example. That wall you're leaning on has industrial alcohol in it. This carpet you're sitting on has industrial alcohol in it. Maybe he is the most. Maybe, do I not pick a marja on this basis? Because it would be impossible for me to live in today's society? Yes or no? Is that relevant? Really, my argument to you and my point to you is that it's not relevant. Your job is to find the most intelligent individual who is proven by Ahlul Khibra and follow him for what his rulings are, regardless of how convenient or inconvenient they are. Now, what will happen sometimes is that you'll come to a point in time where you cannot find any difference between the intellectual capacity of two individuals in common society. When you come to that point that there's no difference and you can't find any difference and no one's disagreeing that these two people are incredibly smart, then you can pick. You can pick either one. But until that time, you'll find many individuals who are contested in their authority and ability to derive law. You should not do their taqlid. Why? Because they're not bringing you to the point that you need to be at to be able to answer the responsibilities that Allah has placed them. Does that make sense? Any questions? We went through a very, very philosophical conversation here in terms of how you get to this point of doing taqlid. And then in taqlid we would talk about what are the conditions on a muqallid, what are the conditions upon a mujtahid. And we can talk about, for example, let's say, for example, I don't do taqlid. Let's say I don't do taqlid and I just perform an action willy-nilly. Well, willy-nilly is a very modern term. Let's say I perform my actions without taking into consideration what Allah has demanded of me. Are they accepted?
No.
No. Why not?
You have to follow
But Allah said pray, I prayed. See, these are very interesting questions and we can get to them in detail, and I want you guys to think about these things and bring back questions on them. Because it's relevant to you. If you're expected to follow an individual, you should understand what that involves. What are the specifics? What does it mean? So for example, a marja has the ability to say that if you performed 10 years of a'mal without doing taqlid of an individual, a marja has the ability to say that those a'mal are accepted or those a'mal are not accepted. Because what is he doing? He's saying, I will take responsibility for those actions for you on the Day of Judgment, that you perform them correctly. Hence this becomes relevant. Otherwise, yeah, you can do whatever you want, but then you're responsible if Allah accepts those actions or doesn't accept those actions. You have to deal with the consequences. This is putting someone, an intermediary who's an expert in faith, between you and Allah on the Day of Judgment. The same way we would want, on the Day of Judgment, the Ahlul Bayt to be our intermediaries because we follow their actions. Any questions? Okay, so next week we'll start our conversation around philosophy of Islam. And you'll probably get one or two questions from here. I know it was a little boring for you guys this week. But, do you want a test? Next week we have a test on the ayat of Tahara that we did, and we'll go through it. And next week what we'll do is we'll start principles of faith, and we'll talk about how Tawheed relates to atheism and proving the existence of Allah from intellectual purposes and all that fun stuff. No questions? Yes.
Are there very specific guidelines for determining a proper marja?
Very specific guidelines for determining a proper marja. The guidelines would be, first off, again, male, adult, adil, just, the most knowledgeable. These are a few of them. There's one or two more after that, actually. But these are characteristics. Then a number of individuals can fit those characteristics. Then the next step is that this person is vetted to have the capacity or the intellectual position to be called a mujtahid, right? So the way Islamic sciences, so if I was to talk you through this, right, what I would say is, when you want to study Islamic sciences, you go to the university. You study, and there are degrees. When you get to the degree of Ba'th al-Kharij, are basically where it's now you're formulating your ability to create an Islamic law, right? What is an Islamic law is created on the basis of Quran and Hadith. Mujtahid's job is to find the interface where these two fit together, and what is the expectation of you based on what Quran says and what Hadith says, and putting the two together and giving you the answer. To say that based on what this Quranic ayat says and what these Hadith tell us, you are obligated to perform X, Y, and Z action in X, Y, and Z condition. Yes? And when a scholar starts studying this, his teacher comes to the conclusion that at some point in time that this individual has now developed the ability to perform this analysis on his own and come to a conclusion about what's required. Now, you can become qualified to perform these rulings and these answers in subjects areas. So for example, you could be a mujtahid in wudu. You could be a mujtahid in salat, a mujtahid in business dealings. All these various aspects you can become in determining najasat, in determining taharat, you can become, and in levels. So as you study, you become an expert in these. When you become an expert in these, you're now a mujtahid. Now from amongst the mujtahideen, what's selected is the most knowledgeable mujtahid to become the marja. Alright? So now amongst all of these, what happens is that there are boards or there are agreements to say that this is the most knowledgeable amongst all of us. And that individual then becomes marja of his time. So for example, in the case of Shaykh al-Ansari, who was a mujtahid of his time and wrote books that are still studied today in the Hawza, almost 700-800 years ago, when his teacher passed away, they came to him and they said, listen, of all the available scholars, you're the most knowledgeable, you become the marja, everybody will follow your actions and emulate your opinion. He said, no, I refuse. He says, when I was younger, there was this Sayyid who I used to study with, and he was more smarter than I am, so go make him the mujtahid. He didn't want it. He says, I don't want to be the mujtahid. I don't want to be the one that everybody emulates. So they went to his contemporary who lived in Hilla. Shaykh al-Ansari lived in Najaf. They went to his contemporary who lived in Hilla. When they went to Hilla and they said, hey, listen, our marja a'lam of the time has passed. We have no mujtahid. We need someone to emulate and someone opinions to follow. And when the Muslims have a question, they need someone to go to. We want you to be that person. He said, well, what about Shaykh al-Ansari? They said, well, Shaykh al-Ansari, he said, you used to study with him and you're smarter than he is. So he says, you should take this responsibility, not him. The Sayyid replied, he said, yes, when I used to study with Ansari, I was smarter than him and I studied more than him. But he says, I left studies 30 years ago. Ansari lives in Najaf and still teaches and is still a student. So therefore, he's more qualified. When this news came back to Shaykh al-Ansari says, I refuse to accept the mantle of mujtahid or marja unless if Imam al-Zaman himself appoints me this position. And he refused. So the people became really frustrated. They didn't have an answer. They didn't know what's going on. They didn't know what to do now because this person who should take this responsibility on his head and guide all the people, this person who should be the point person that all the Muslimin can ask their questions to and get a definitive answer on, is refusing to accept this mantle of responsibility. And they argued with him a bit, and he didn't give an answer. One day he was teaching his class. And he's teaching his class in the front and all the students are gathered around him. And from the back somebody stands up and says, oh Shaykh, I have a question for you. Shaykh says, ask. So this person says, let's say there's a woman and she's married to a man and Allah sends His punishment on this man and turns this man into a dog. What is the condition of that woman? Is she divorced? And if she's divorced, what type of iddah should she observe? What happens to this woman? Right? Because a minute ago she was married, now is she married to a dog? What's the ruling? So Shaykh al-Ansari, who's sitting in his class and teaching, he turns and he says, it's a very interesting question. The answer to that question would be depending on, was that dog alive or a statue? And he continues, he says, if Allah turned that man into the statue of a dog, he's dead. So the woman is divorced, or she's a widow, and she observes the iddah of a widow. He says, however, if Allah turned that man into a living dog, man's still alive, but she can't be married to a dog, so she's divorced. And she observes the iddah, or the separation time period, of a divorced woman. He says, but your question in general is moot. Because since the coming of Rahmatul lil Alameen, Rasulullah Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, Allah has promised that He will not send down His punishment on people until the Day of Judgment. So to that end, that couldn't happen. So this person who asked the question, he says, truly you are the mujtahid. Truly you are the marja. He says it 3 times and leaves. Now Shaykh al-Ansari sits for a second, and he turns to his students and he says, geniuses, do you know who that was? They say, no, who was it? He says, that was Imam Zaman, that was the Imam of our time, go catch him. So they go running out to go see him. Where did he go? And ask him more questions and be with him, and he disappeared. And immediately Shaykh al-Ansari knew that this is his responsibility now to become the marja' of the time, and to take the responsibility for all the mu'mineen around the world and be the source of answers and information for them. Does that make sense? So, where did we start from? What was the question again?
Are there specific guidelines to follow in picking?
Guidelines. Does that answer your question a little bit? Interesting story, right? But the guidelines in general are is that once someone meets these qualifications, they have to be deemed by the scholars within the area to be the most knowledgeable. If there are people who deem this individual to be the most knowledgeable of all the scholars available, he is eligible for emulation. What he publishes is known as all of his rulings, and relating to these 2 areas that we talked about, worship and day-to-day dealings. And he has to publish along all those guidelines and present all that information on those basis so that people have resources available to them, and then he makes himself available to answer questions, and he becomes a point person for the ummah in total.
What if, like, the mujtahid does a sin?
What if? One of the conditions for being a mujtahid is to be an adl person, right? Be a just person. That means that this person doesn't sin. If, for example, adalat is such a beautiful thing that as soon as you make one sin or you make one mistake, you lose all of it. You're no longer just. However, as soon as you ask for forgiveness, it comes right back. So the person who, for example, sins and then never asks for forgiveness for his sin, or never acknowledges that he sins, can no longer be a mujtahid, can no longer be a mabdi. Any other questions? No? Alright. Sallallahu ala Muhammadin wa ali Muhammad.
Ya Hadi! Ya Hadi! Mashallah, mashallah.